The desert sun was merciless that day in 1887, beating down on the dusty town of Silver Creek like the wrath of an angry god. Most folks stayed indoors, but not Jake Morrison. He had a debt to settle and a reputation to protect. Little did he know that one act of defiance against injustice would bind him to a fierce Apache woman whose spirit burned brighter than the Arizona sun itself. What started as a simple rescue would become the most dangerous and passionate adventure of his life. She saved his soul while he saved her life, but freedom would demand a price neither of them expected to pay. In the untamed wilderness of the American Southwest, where survival meant everything and love was a luxury few could afford, their story would challenge everything the world believed about race, loyalty, and the true meaning of courage. This is the tale of how a drifting cowboy met his match in a woman who refused to be conquered, and how together they would face down an entire territory that wanted them dead. Jake Morrison rode into Silver Creek with dust caking his weathered face and trouble weighing heavy on his mind. The town looked like every other frontier settlement he'd drifted through in the past 5 years since the war ended. Wooden buildings lined the main street like broken teeth, their paint peeling under the relentless Arizona sun. Horses stood tied to hitching posts with their heads hanging low, too tired to swish away the flies that buzzed around their ears. The saloon doors swung open as Jake approached, and the sound of rough laughter spilled onto the street. Through the gaps in the batwing doors, he caught glimpses of men hunched over card tables and women in faded dresses serving drinks. The familiar smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke drifted out, mixing with the dust and horse manure that seemed to coat everything in this godforsaken territory. Jake had come to Silver Creek tracking a man named Colt Briggs, a cattle rustler who'd stolen horses from the ranch where Jake had been working. The job paid well enough, but Jake had learned not to get too attached to any one place. Towns like Silver Creek had a way of chewing up drifters and spitting them out, and Jake had no intention of putting down roots. He just wanted to collect his bounty and move on to the next job. As he guided his horse toward the saloon, a commotion erupted from behind the general store. Angry voices carried on the hot air, and Jake could make out at least 3 men shouting. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip. In his experience, crowds of angry men in small towns usually meant someone was about to get hurt. He dismounted and tied his horse to the rail, then walked around the side of the building to investigate. What he saw there made his blood run cold. 3 white men had cornered a young Apache woman against the back wall of the store. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and she wore traditional buckskin clothing that marked her as one of the local tribal people. But it was her eyes that caught Jake's attention. Even surrounded and outnumbered, she stared at her attackers with fierce defiance, like a cornered wildcat ready to fight. The largest of the 3 men, a heavy-set brute with a scraggly beard, was reaching for the woman with meaty hands. "Come on, Apache girl," he slurred, clearly drunk despite the early hour. "We just want to have some fun with you. No need to make this difficult." The woman spat something in her native language that Jake didn't understand, but the tone made her meaning clear. She pressed herself against the wall, looking for an escape route, but the men had her trapped. The second man, thin and wiry with cruel eyes, laughed at her defiance. "She's got spirit. I'll give her that," he said to his companions. "Makes it more interesting." Jake had seen enough. He'd witnessed plenty of cruelty during his years drifting from town to town, but something about this situation struck him differently. Maybe it was the woman's courage in the face of impossible odds, or maybe it was just that he'd had enough of watching bullies prey on the helpless. Either way, he found himself stepping around the corner of the building. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down his share of trouble. "I think the lady has made it clear she's not interested in your company." The 3 men turned to face him, and Jake could see the calculation in their eyes. They were trying to decide if this stranger was worth the trouble. The big one with the beard seemed to be their leader. He looked Jake up and down, taking in his trail-worn clothes and the way his hand rested casually near his gun. "This ain't your business, stranger," the bearded man said. "We're just having a conversation with this Apache girl here. Nothing that concerns you." Jake stepped closer, and the woman's dark eyes flicked to his face. He saw something there that surprised him. Not gratitude, but a warning. She was telling him to be careful, as if she was more concerned for his safety than her own. The realization made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Well, from where I'm standing, it looks like 3 grown men cornering one unarmed woman. Jake replied, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made the thin man take a step back. Where I come from, we call that being yellow-bellied cowards. The insult hit its mark. The bearded man's face flushed red with anger, and his hand moved toward his gun. But Jake was faster. His Colt cleared leather in one smooth motion, and suddenly, the 3 men found themselves staring down the barrel of a well-maintained revolver. Now, I suggest you boys find something else to do with your afternoon, Jake said, his tone conversational despite the deadly weapon in his hand. Maybe head over to the saloon and work on getting even drunker. That seems to be what you're good at. The 3 men looked at each other, weighing their options. Jake could see the wheels turning in their heads. They outnumbered him, but he had them dead to rights with his gun drawn. The smart play was to back down and live to fight another day. The thin man was the first to break. "Come on, Pete," he said to the bearded leader. "She ain't worth getting shot over. There's plenty of other entertainment in town." But Pete wasn't ready to give up so easily. Jake could see the stubborn pride burning in his eyes, the kind that got men killed in frontier towns. "You don't know what you're interfering with, stranger," Pete growled. "This Apache, which probably put some kind of spell on you. They're all the same, these savage women. Nothing but trouble." The woman said something sharp in Apache, and Pete's face twisted with rage. He started to reach for his gun despite the weapon pointed at him, but Jake's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, friend. My finger's getting mighty itchy, and I'd hate to have to explain to the sheriff why I had to ventilate you." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, Pete's survival instinct won out over his pride. He slowly raised his hands and took a step back. "This ain't over, stranger," he said, his voice full of poison. "You just made yourself some powerful enemies. Silver Creek don't take kindly to outsiders who interfere in local business." "I'll take my chances," Jake replied, never moving the gun from its target. "Now get going before I decide you're more trouble than you're worth." The 3 men backed away slowly, their eyes never leaving Jake's face. Only when they disappeared around the corner of the building did Jake lower his weapon. He turned to the Apache woman, expecting to see relief or gratitude in her expression. Instead, she was studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. She was beautiful, Jake realized, but not in the soft, pampered way of the saloon girls or ranch owners' daughters he'd known. Her beauty was wild and fierce like the desert landscape itself. High cheekbones and smooth copper skin spoke of her heritage, but it was the strength in her bearing that truly caught his attention. Even after being threatened and cornered, she stood straight and proud, showing no signs of fear or weakness. "You speak English?" Jake asked, sliding his gun back into its holster. She nodded slowly. "I speak your language," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent, but perfectly clear. "Though I wonder why you helped me." Most white men would have joined them or walked away. The question caught Jake off guard. He'd acted on instinct, but now that she asked, he wasn't sure he could explain his motivation. "I don't like seeing anyone get bullied," he said finally. "Doesn't matter what color their skin is." She tilted her head, still studying him with those penetrating eyes. "You are different from the others," she said. "But you have made dangerous enemies today. Pete Garrison owns the biggest ranch in this territory, and his family has influence with the territorial government. They will not forget what happened here." "Pete Garrison?" Jake repeated the name, filing it away for future reference. "Well, I reckon I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. Right now, I'm more concerned about making sure you get somewhere safe." Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. "You do not know me," she said. "I could be exactly what they said, a witch who casts spells on white men." Jake found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Well, if you are, it's a pretty subtle spell. I don't feel any different than I did 5 minutes ago." She almost smiled in return, but caught herself. "I am called Iana," she said. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "Jake Morrison," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "And I'd say your name suits you perfectly." This time she did smile, though it was small and quickly hidden. "You should leave this town, Jake Morrison. The Garrisons will not let this insult stand, especially not from a drifter with no protection." "What about you?" Jake asked. "Those men will just wait until I'm gone and come after you again. Ayana's expression hardened. I can take care of myself. I've been doing so for many years. Jake believed her. There was a strength in her bearing that spoke of someone who'd survived more than her share of hardships. But something about the situation didn't sit right with him. What were you doing in town alone? Don't your people usually travel in groups? The question seemed to hit a nerve. Ayana's eyes flashed with pain before she could hide it. My people are gone, she said quietly. I'm the last of my clan. The words hung in the air between them like a physical weight. Jake had heard stories of Apache clans being wiped out by disease, warfare, or forced relocation, but he'd never met a survivor before. The tragedy of it struck him like a physical blow. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. That must be lonely, she finished for him. Yes, it is very lonely. They stood in silence for a moment, two survivors recognizing something in each other. Jake realized that despite their different backgrounds, they had more in common than he'd initially thought. Both were alone in the world. Both had learned to rely only on themselves. Where do you live now? He asked gently. Ayana gestured toward the desert hills that rose beyond the town. There is a canyon about 5 miles north of here. I have made a camp there. It is hidden and defensible. Jake nodded, understanding the tactical thinking behind her choice. A hidden canyon would provide water, shelter, and natural fortifications against enemies. It was exactly the kind of place he would have chosen in her situation. I could escort you back there, he offered. Make sure those men don't try to follow you. She shook her head immediately. No, you have done enough, and I will not have your death on my conscience. The garrisons will be watching for you now. Your best chance is to ride out of town immediately and never come back. Jake knew she was probably right. The smart thing to do would be to collect his horse and head for the next territory. He had no ties to Silver Creek, no reason to stay and fight someone else's battles. But as he looked at Ayana's proud, solitary figure, he found himself reluctant to leave. What if I don't want to leave? He heard himself asking. She looked at him sharply. Why would you stay? You know nothing about me or my troubles. That was true enough, Jake reflected. He'd known this woman for all of 10 minutes, and already she was complicating his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. But there was something about her that drew him in, something beyond her physical beauty or even her courage. Maybe it was recognition, the understanding that they were both outsiders, both survivors in a world that didn't seem to have a place for them. Maybe I'm tired of running, he said, surprising himself with his honesty. Maybe I'm ready to make a stand somewhere. Ayana studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in his eyes. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. If you're determined to stay, then you should know what you are getting yourself into, she said. The garrisons are not just wealthy ranchers. They have connections to the territorial government and the army. They have been trying to force me off my land for months now, claiming it belongs to them under some old Spanish grant. Does it? Jake asked. Her eyes flashed with anger. My people lived in that canyon for generations before any white man set foot in this territory. But according to the white man's laws, we never owned anything because we did not have pieces of paper to prove it. Jake understood the injustice of it, even if he couldn't do anything to change the larger system. So they're trying to drive you out. They have tried many things, Ayana said grimly. Poisoning my water source, shooting at me when I come to town for supplies. Today was just the latest attempt. The picture was becoming clearer now. The confrontation Jake had interrupted wasn't random. It was part of a systematic campaign of harassment designed to force Ayana to abandon her home. The realization made his anger burn hotter. How long have you been fighting them alone? He asked. 6 months, she replied. Since the last members of my clan died from the spotted sickness. 6 months of fighting a wealthy, influential family single-handed. Jake couldn't imagine the courage and determination it must have taken. Most people would have given up and moved on long ago, but Ayana had stayed and fought for what was hers. You can't keep this up forever, he said gently. Eventually, they'll wear you down or get lucky. Perhaps, she admitted. But I will not give up my people's sacred ground without a fight. That canyon contains the graves of my ancestors. I am a guardian now, and I will not abandon my duty. The depth of her commitment struck Jake like a physical blow. Here was someone who understood loyalty and honor in a way that most people never would. She was willing to die rather than abandon her responsibility to the dead. In that moment, Jake made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Then you won't be fighting alone anymore, he said quietly. Ayana's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. You cannot mean that. You do not understand what you are offering. I understand enough, Jake replied. I understand that sometimes a person has to make a stand, regardless of the odds. And I understand that some things are worth fighting for, even if you haven't known them very long. She searched his face again, looking for any sign of doubt or deception. When she found none, she nodded slowly. If you truly mean to help me, then we should leave town now, she said, before the garrisons have time to organize their friends. Jake looked back toward the main street, where his horse waited. He thought about his original plan. Find Colt Briggs, collect the bounty, and move on to the next job. It had been a simple plan, one that would have kept him safe and solvent. Instead, he was about to throw his lot in with a lone Apache woman fighting a battle she probably couldn't win. It should have been an easy choice. Logic dictated that he should wish Ayana luck, and right away. But as he looked at her standing there in the shadow of the general store, proud and defiant despite everything she'd endured, Jake realized that easy choices had never been his strong suit. Lead the way, he said. The ride to Ayana's canyon took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country Jake had ever seen. They left Silver Creek by the back trails, avoiding the main roads where the garrisons might have posted lookouts. Ayana led the way on a paint horse that seemed to know every rock and crevice in the desert landscape. She moved through the terrain with an easy confidence that spoke of years spent learning every detail of this harsh but magnificent land. Jake followed behind, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. The desert stretched out around them in all directions, a vast expanse of red rock formations, scattered cacti, and hardy scrub brush that somehow managed to thrive in this unforgiving environment. The sun beat down mercilessly, but there was something about the stark beauty of the landscape that called to something deep in Jake's soul. As they rode, Ayana began to speak about the land they were crossing. She pointed out landmarks that had meaning for her people, a distinctive rock formation where warriors once kept watch for enemies, a hidden spring that had saved her clan during a particularly brutal drought, a grove of ancient trees where the tribal council had met to make important decisions. Your people knew this country well, Jake observed, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. We were part of it, Ayana replied, her voice carrying a note of sadness. White men see the desert as something to be conquered or crossed as quickly as possible. But we understood that we were just one small part of a much larger whole. The land was not ours to own. We belonged to the land. Jake pondered her words as they continued their journey. In his years of drifting from place to place, he'd never felt that kind of connection to any particular piece of ground. Every town, every ranch, every stretch of country had been temporary in his mind. He'd never allowed himself to put down roots or think of anywhere as truly home. But as they rode deeper into Ayana's territory, Jake began to understand what she meant. There was something about this landscape that got into a person's blood. The way the light played across the red rocks at different times of day, the sound of wind through the canyons, the vast silence that seemed to stretch on forever. It all combined to create a sense of belonging that Jake had never experienced before. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and take shelter from the worst of the heat. Ayana led them to a small cave carved into the side of a cliff, where ancient drawings covered the walls. Jake stared at the primitive but expressive figures painted in red and black pigments. These were made by my ancestors, Ayana explained, running her fingers gently over one of the images. They tell the story of our people's journey to this land, and of the great battles fought to protect it. The drawings depicted scenes of hunting, warfare, and tribal ceremonies. Jake could make out human figures on horseback, herds of buffalo, and what looked like depictions of white soldiers. The artistry was crude by some standards, but there was an emotional power to the images that spoke across the centuries. How old are these? Jake asked, his voice hushed with respect. Some are very old, from the time before the Spanish came, Ayana replied. Others are more recent. My grandfather added to them, and his grandfather before him. Each generation left its mark, adding to the story of our people. Jake studied a particularly striking image of a warrior on horseback facing down what appeared to be a much larger force. This looks like it could be you, he said, gesturing to the lone figure. Ayana smiled sadly. Perhaps it is. The struggles of each generation echo those that came before. My people have always been fighters, always been willing to stand against impossible odds to protect what matters most to us. They resumed their journey in the afternoon, and as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, they finally reached Iana's Canyon. Jake's first glimpse of it took his breath away. The entrance was narrow and easily missed, hidden behind a cluster of large boulders that looked like they'd been placed there deliberately. But once they squeezed through the gap, the canyon opened up into a hidden paradise. A small stream ran down the center of the canyon floor, fed by a spring that bubbled up from somewhere deep underground. Cottonwood trees grew along the banks of the stream, their leaves providing blessed shade from the desert sun. The canyon walls rose high on either side, creating a natural fortress that would be almost impossible to attack directly. But what truly impressed Jake was the evidence of human habitation. Iana hadn't just been surviving in this place. She'd been living here, making it into a true home. A small but well-built shelter stood near the stream, constructed from local stone and timber in a way that blended perfectly with the natural surroundings. Nearby, Jake could see a garden where Iana had been growing corn, beans, and squash using irrigation channels she'd dug from the stream. "This is incredible," Jake said, dismounting from his horse and looking around in wonder. "You built all this yourself?" Iana nodded, though she seemed pleased by his admiration. "My people taught me well. We believed in being self-sufficient, in being able to survive anywhere we made camp." Jake walked over to examine her shelter more closely. The construction was ingenious, using the natural rock formations of the canyon wall as one side of the structure while building out with carefully fitted stones. The roof was made of wooden beams covered with hide and sealed with some kind of natural waterproofing. "This isn't just survival," Jake said. "This is craftsmanship. You could live here comfortably for years." "That was the idea," Iana replied, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But the garrisons have made it clear they will not allow me to stay. They want this land for their cattle, and they are willing to kill me to get it." Jake turned to face her, struck again by the quiet strength in her voice. Most people would have been broken by months of constant threat and harassment, but Iana seemed to draw strength from the land itself. She belonged here in a way that Jake had never belonged anywhere. "Show me the boundaries of your territory," he said. "I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Iana led him to a rocky outcropping that provided a view of the surrounding landscape. She pointed out the natural landmarks that defined her people's traditional territory: a distinctive peak to the north, a dry riverbed to the east, a line of mesas to the south and west. "By the white man's laws, none of this belongs to us," she said bitterly. "But my people lived here for countless generations. Every stone, every tree, every blade of grass has meaning for us. The spirits of my ancestors rest in this soil." Jake studied the terrain with a tactical eye, noting the defensible positions and potential escape routes. "The garrisons want all of this. They claim it under an old Spanish land grant," Iana explained. "Papers signed by men who never set foot in this territory, giving away lands that were already inhabited by people who had been here for thousands of years." The injustice of it made Jake's blood boil. He'd seen plenty of corruption and greed in his years of drifting, but there's something particularly galling about the systematic theft of an entire people's homeland. The garrisons weren't content with their existing wealth. They wanted everything, even if it meant destroying the last survivor of an ancient culture. "Have you tried appealing to the territorial authorities?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Iana's laugh was bitter. "The territorial governor is Pete Garrison's brother-in-law. The local sheriff is on their payroll. The army commander owes them money from gambling debts. Who exactly would I appeal to?" Jake nodded grimly. It was the same old story he'd seen played out in dozens of frontier towns. A few powerful families controlling everything while the law looked the other way. In a situation like that, justice had to come from the barrel of a gun or not at all. They returned to the canyon floor as the sun disappeared behind the western rim. Iana began preparing a simple meal from supplies she had cached in her shelter, while Jake tended to their horses and made sure they had adequate water and forage. The domestic routine felt strange after years of solitary travel, but also oddly comforting. As they ate by the light of a small fire, Jake found himself studying Iana's face in the flickering flames. She was even more beautiful than he'd initially realized, but it was her inner strength that truly captivated him. Here was a woman who'd lost everything, her family, her people, her entire way of life, and yet refused to give up or give in. She faced each new day with courage and determination, fighting battles that would have broken most men. "Tell me about your people," Jake said quietly. "What were they like?" Ayanna was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing faces there that Jake couldn't perceive. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft with memory and loss. "We were called the Red Canyon people," she said. "We were not a large clan, perhaps 60 souls at our strongest. But we were known throughout the territory as skilled warriors and craftspeople. My father was the war chief, my mother the clan's medicine woman." She paused, and Jake could see the pain in her eyes. "The spotted sickness came 3 years ago. It killed half our number in the first month. Those who survived were too weak to hunt or fight. One by one they died, until only I remained." "Why didn't you die with them?" Jake asked gently. "My mother gave me immunity," Ayanna replied. She had learned the white man's medicine from a missionary's wife. She knew how to prevent the sickness, but the knowledge came too late to save the others. Jake felt a deep ache in his chest as he imagined what she must have endured. To watch an entire people, your people, slowly die while being powerless to save them would have driven most people to madness or despair. Yet Ayanna had endured it and emerged stronger. "You could have left," he observed, "gone to live with another clan, or even try to make a life in the white settlements." Ayanna shook her head firmly. "I'm the last keeper of our sacred places. The spirits of my ancestors depend on me to protect their resting places and maintain the old ways. If I abandoned my duty, their souls would wander forever without peace." Jake understood duty and loyalty, but the weight of responsibility Ayanna carried seemed almost unbearable. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for the memory and honor of an entire people. "The garrisons must know how important this place is to you," he said. "They're counting on wearing you down, making you give up out of exhaustion or despair. They do not understand Apache women," Ayanna replied with a small smile. "We are taught from childhood that some things are more important than life itself. Honor, duty, the protection of sacred ground. These matter more than personal comfort or safety." Jake had known some tough women in his time, but none who carried themselves with the quiet dignity and fierce determination that Ayanna displayed. She was like a force of nature, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. "What about you?" Ayanna asked suddenly. "What made you a drifter? Most men your age have settled down somewhere, started families." The question caught Jake off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to keeping his past private that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone show genuine interest in his story. But something about the intimacy of the firelit canyon made him want to be honest. "I had a family once," he said slowly. "A wife and a little girl. We had a farm in Kansas, nothing fancy, but it was ours." Ayanna waited patiently for him to continue, seeming to sense that this wasn't an easy story to tell. "The war came, and I enlisted," Jake went on. "Thought I was doing the right thing, fighting for the Union cause. When I came back 4 years later, there was nothing left. Disease had taken them both while I was gone." "I'm sorry," Ayanna said quietly, and Jake could hear the genuine sympathy in her voice. "I sold the farm and started drifting," Jake continued. "Figured there was no point in putting down roots again. Told myself I was better off alone, that caring about people just led to heartbreak. But you helped me today," Ayanna observed. "You could have walked away, but you chose to get involved. That doesn't sound like a man who has given up on caring." Jake looked across the fire at her, struck by her insight. "Maybe I'm tired of running from everything that matters," he admitted. "Maybe I'm ready to fight for something again." Ayanna studied his face in the firelight, and Jake felt as though she was looking straight into his soul. "Fighting the garrisons will not be like the war," she said. "This will be personal, bitter, with no rules and no mercy. They will try to destroy everything you care about. Then, I'd better make sure I care about the right things," Jake replied. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they both contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. Jake realized that in the space of a single day, his entire life had changed direction. Yesterday, he'd been a rootless drifter with no ties to anyone or anything. Tonight, he was committed to helping a woman fight for her ancestral homeland against impossible odds. It should have terrified him, but instead Jake felt more alive than he had in years. For the first time since the war ended, he had a purpose beyond simple survival. He had something worth fighting for, and someone worth fighting alongside. We should get some rest, Ayana said finally, banking the fire until only coals remained. Tomorrow we will need to begin preparing our defenses. The garrisons will not wait long before they come for us. Jake nodded and began laying out his bedroll near the dying fire. As he prepared for sleep, he found himself acutely aware of Ayana moving around the canyon, checking her traps and securing her supplies for the night. Every movement was graceful and purposeful, like a dancer performing a well-rehearsed routine. "Jake," she said quietly when they were both settled for the night. "Thank you for helping me today and for choosing to stay. I had forgotten what it felt like to not be completely alone." "Thank you for letting me stay," Jake replied. "I've forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere." As he lay staring up at the star-filled sky visible between the canyon walls, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A few hours ago, he'd been a stranger to this woman and this land. Now he felt as though he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. The desert night was full of sounds. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. But Jake found these sounds comforting rather than threatening. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and probably new dangers. The garrisons wouldn't give up easily, and Jake had no illusions about the odds they were facing. But tonight, lying under the vast desert sky with Ayana sleeping peacefully nearby, Jake felt hope stirring in his chest like a long-dormant ember suddenly bursting into flame. He was no longer running from his past or drifting aimlessly toward an uncertain future. He had found his place in the world, and he was determined to fight for it with everything he had. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of Ayana moving quietly around the canyon. She was already dressed and preparing for the day, her movements efficient and purposeful. The dying embers of their fire cast a faint glow over the canyon walls, but the sky above was still dark with pre-dawn shadows. "You're an early riser," Jake observed, rolling up his bedroll and stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on hard ground. "The desert teaches you to make use of the cool hours," Ayana replied, handing him a cup of coffee made from grounds she'd been hoarding. "Besides, we have much work to do if we want to be ready when the garrisons come." The coffee was bitter, but welcome, and Jake savored the warmth as he looked around the canyon with fresh eyes. In daylight, he could see details he'd missed the night before. The walls of the canyon were honeycombed with small caves and ledges, natural fortifications that could provide excellent defensive positions. The stream that ran down the center provided both water and a natural obstacle that would funnel attackers into predictable paths. "This place is a natural fortress," Jake said admiringly. With the right preparations, a small force could hold off a much larger attacking group. Ayana nodded, pleased that he understood the tactical advantages of her home. "My people chose this place for exactly that reason. We have fought off attacks here before, in the old days when the cavalry tried to force us onto the reservation." "Show me the weak points," Jake said, setting down his coffee cup and preparing for what he suspected would be a long day of planning and preparation. They spent the morning exploring every inch of the canyon's defenses. Ayana showed Jake the hidden paths that led to the rim, the concealed caves where supplies could be stored, and the natural choke points where enemies could be stopped or slowed. She pointed out the locations where her clan's warriors had once positioned themselves during battles, sharing tactical knowledge passed down through generations of Apache fighters. Jake was impressed by the sophistication of the defensive system. The Apache hadn't just relied on the natural advantages of the terrain. They had improved on them with carefully placed stone walls, concealed fighting positions, and escape routes that allowed defenders to disappear into the desert if the canyon was overrun. "Your people were smart fighters," Jake observed as they stood on a ledge overlooking the canyon entrance. They understood that winning wasn't always about killing the most enemies. Sometimes it was about making the cost of victory too high for your opponents to bear. "The Apache way of war," Ayana agreed. "We could not match the white soldiers in numbers or weapons, but we could make them pay such a price for every inch of ground that they would eventually give up and go away." "Will that work with the garrisons?" Jake asked. Ayana's expression darkened. "The garrisons are not soldiers following orders from distant commanders. This is personal for them. They want this land, and they want me gone. They will not give up easily." As if summoned by her words, The sound of horses reached them from the desert beyond the canyon entrance. Jake and Ayanna immediately took cover behind the rocky outcropping, peering carefully through gaps in the stone. A group of riders was approaching the hidden entrance to the canyon, moving slowly and methodically as if searching for something. Jake counted 6 men, all heavily armed and wearing the kind of practical clothing favored by working cowboys. But there was something purposeful about their movements that suggested they weren't ordinary ranch hands. These were men who knew how to fight and weren't afraid to use violence to get what they wanted. Garrison's men? Jake whispered. Ayanna nodded grimly. I recognized 2 of them. The big one, the black hat, is Tom Brennan, Pete Garrison's foreman. The thin one beside him is called Snake Morrison. No relation to you, I hope. Jake studied the riders more carefully. Brennan looked like the kind of man who'd earned his position through a combination of competence and ruthlessness. He sat his horse with easy confidence, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain around him. Snake Morrison lived up to his nickname, with a lean build and predatory movements that reminded Jake unpleasantly of a rattler preparing to strike. They're looking for the entrance, Jake observed as the riders spread out to search among the boulders. How much do they know about this place? More than I would like, Ayanna admitted. Pete Garrison has been questioning people in town, offering money for information about my hideout. Someone must have given him general directions. Jake watched as the searchers methodically worked their way closer to the concealed entrance. They were being thorough, checking every possible hiding place among the rocks. It was only a matter of time before they found the narrow gap that led into the canyon. We need to discourage them, Jake said quietly. Make them think this area is more dangerous than it's worth. Ayanna looked at him questioningly, but Jake was already moving. He worked his way carefully along the canyon rim until he found a position that overlooked the searchers. The range was long for a handgun, but Jake had always been a good shot, and he had a rifle in his saddle pack back at camp. He signaled for Ayanna to stay hidden, then made his way back down to the canyon floor. He retrieved his Winchester from his gear and quickly checked the action. The rifle was well-maintained and accurate, a tool he'd relied on many times during his years of drifting. By the time Jake returned to his overwatch position, the searchers had found the entrance to the canyon. Brennan was studying the narrow gap with professional interest, while 2 of his men dismounted to explore on foot. Jake took careful aim and fired a single shot that struck the ground directly between the 2 dismounted men. They dove for cover immediately, their horses shying and whinnying in alarm. The sound of the rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, amplified and distorted until it sounded like an entire company of marksmen. That's far enough, gentlemen, Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. You're trespassing on private property. Brennan had drawn his pistol at the sound of the shot, but he couldn't see where the bullet had come from. Jake's position on the canyon rim provided excellent concealment, while giving him a clear field of fire over the entire approach. You the stranger who interfered in town yesterday? Brennan called back. Mr. Garrison wants to have a word with you. Mr. Garrison can make an appointment like anybody else. Jake replied, right now, you boys need to turn around and head back where you came from. Snake Morrison had also taken cover, but Jake could see him trying to work his way around to a flanking position. Jake put a bullet in the ground near Snake's feet, sending the man scrambling back to the main group. You can't stay up there forever, stranger, Brennan shouted. We know you're protecting that Apache woman. Hand her over, and we'll let you ride away. Nobody's getting handed over to anybody. Jake called back. This is your last warning. Get out of here, or the next shots won't be aimed at the ground. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with neither side willing to make the first aggressive move. Jake knew he held the advantage for now. His elevated position and superior cover made it almost impossible for the garrison men to attack effectively. But he also knew they wouldn't give up easily. Men like Brennan didn't back down from a fight, especially when their employer's reputation was at stake. The stalemate was broken when one of the younger members of Brennan's group lost his nerve. Jake saw him break cover and make a run for his horse, apparently deciding that the job wasn't worth getting shot over. The sight of their companion retreating seemed to affect the morale of the remaining men. Brennan cursed loudly and fired several shots in Jake's general direction, but the bullet struck harmlessly against the rock face well below his position. The foreman was shooting blind, hoping to get lucky or force Jake to reveal his exact location. Jake responded with another precisely placed shot that sent Brennan diving behind a large boulder. The message was clear: Jake could hit whatever he aimed at, and the garrison men were completely exposed in the open desert. "This ain't over," Brennan shouted as he and his men began retreating toward their horses. "Mr. Garrison ain't gonna let this stand. You made yourself some serious enemies today. Tell Mr. Garrison he's welcome to come discuss the matter in person." Jake called back, "I'll give him the same warm reception." The garrison men mounted up and rode away, but Jake noticed they didn't go far. Instead, they took up positions about half a mile away, well out of rifle range, but close enough to keep watch on the canyon entrance. It was clear they intended to maintain surveillance, probably waiting for reinforcements or a better opportunity to attack. Jake made his way back down to the canyon floor, where Ayanna was waiting with an expression of mixed admiration and concern. "That was well done," she said. "You bought us time, but they will not give up so easily." "I know," Jake replied, checking his rifle to make sure it was fully loaded. "But now we know what we're dealing with. They're professionals, but they're not soldiers. They can be discouraged if we make the cost high enough." Ayanna nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "There is something else you should know. Pete Garrison has connections beyond this territory. If he is desperate enough, he might call in favors from friends in the territorial government or even the army." The implications of that statement hit Jake like a physical blow. Fighting off a handful of hired guns was one thing, but facing down federal troops would be something else entirely. They would need allies of their own if the situation escalated that far. "Do you have friends among the other Apache clans?" Jake asked. "People who might be willing to help?" Ayanna's face clouded with sadness. "Most of the Apache in this region have been moved to the reservation. Those who remain are scattered and, hiding, try to avoid the attention of the authorities. They cannot risk exposing themselves to help me." Jake understood the bitter reality of her situation. Ayanna was truly alone in her fight, with no clan to support her and no legal recourse available through the white man's system of justice. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that the garrisons were counting on to force her surrender. "Then, we'll have to be creative," Jake said. "David beat Goliath, after all." They spent the rest of the day improving their defenses and preparing for a longer siege. Jake showed Ayanna how to construct simple but effective obstacles that would funnel attackers into killing zones. They moved rocks to create better cover for defensive positions and cache supplies of water and ammunition at strategic points throughout the canyon. As they worked, Jake found himself increasingly impressed by Ayanna's knowledge and skills. She knew every useful plant in the desert, could track animals or humans across terrain that looked barren to Jake's eyes, and possessed an intuitive understanding of tactics and strategy that would have made her valuable in any army. "You're wasted out here fighting alone," Jake told her as they took a break from their preparations. "You could have been a great leader if circumstances had been different." Ayanna smiled sadly. "I was being trained to be a war chief's wife," she said. "My people believe that women should understand warfare as well as men, since we might need to defend our families and homes while the warriors were away." "What happened to your intended husband?" Jake asked gently. "He died in the spotted sickness," Ayanna replied, "along with all the other young men of our clan. I am the last, not just of my bloodline, but of an entire generation." The weight of her loss struck Jake anew. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival or even for her ancestral homeland. She was fighting to preserve the memory and honor of everyone she had ever loved. The responsibility must have been almost unbearable. As evening approached, they could see smoke rising from the garrison men's camp in the distance. The surveillance was continuing, and Jake suspected that reinforcements would be arriving soon. Pete Garrison wasn't the type of man who would accept defeat gracefully, especially not at the hands of Drifter and an Apache woman. "They'll try something tonight," Jake predicted as he and Ayanna shared another simple meal by their small fire. "Probably send a few men to probe our defenses under cover of darkness." Ayanna nodded agreement. "Apache tactics," she said with grim humor. "It seems the white men have learned something from us after all." Jake laughed despite the seriousness of their situation. "Well, then, we'll have to teach them a few more lessons they won't forget." As the sun set and darkness settled over the desert, Jake and Ayanna took up positions near the canyon entrance. Jake had his rifle ready, while Ayanna carried a bow that she'd strung with silent efficiency. They settled in to wait, knowing that the night would likely bring the first real test of their partnership. Jake found himself thinking about the strange path that had led him to this place. 24 hours ago, he'd been a rootless drifter with no ties to anyone or anything. Now he was prepared to risk his life defending a woman he barely knew and a piece of land that meant nothing to him personally. But as he glanced at Ayana's profile in the starlight, Jake realized that his feelings for this place and this woman were no longer purely intellectual. Something had changed in him during their day of preparation and shared purpose. He was no longer just helping a stranger in need. He was fighting for something that had become precious to him. The sound of approaching horses reached them just after midnight. Jake counted at least 4 riders moving slowly through the darkness, trying to approach the canyon entrance without being detected. They were good, but not quite good enough to fool 2 people who were expecting them. Jake sighted carefully through his rifle scope and waited for the perfect moment. When the lead rider came into clear view, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Jake squeezed the trigger. The shot took the man's hat clean off his head, and his horse reared in alarm. The other riders immediately scattered, seeking cover among the rocks and brush. But Ayana was ready for them. Her bow sang in the darkness, and Jake heard one of the men curse loudly as her arrow found its mark. "Next one goes between your eyes," Jake called out into the night. "Turn around and ride away, or start saying your prayers." The night attack dissolved into chaos as the garrison men tried to withdraw while maintaining some semblance of dignity. Jake and Ayana had proven that they couldn't be caught off guard or intimidated by shows of force. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. Pete Garrison's pride was now at stake, and men like him would escalate rather than admit defeat. The real war was just starting, and the stakes were about to get much higher. The morning after the failed night attack brought an ominous quiet to the desert. Jake woke to find Ayana already up and studying the distant smoke from the garrison camp through a small spyglass she'd produced from her supplies. Her expression was grim as she handed him the instrument. "More riders came during the night," she said quietly. "I count at least 12 men now, maybe more." Jake peered through the spyglass and cursed under his breath. The garrison camp had grown substantially overnight. He could make out several new horses and what looked like additional supplies being unloaded from a wagon. More concerning was the disciplined way the men were organizing themselves, setting up what appeared to be a proper military-style camp with sentries and defensive positions. "These aren't just ranch hands anymore," Jake observed. "Garrisons brought in professionals." Ayana nodded, her face troubled. And there, she pointed to a dust cloud on the horizon. "More are coming." Jake watched the approaching riders with growing unease. Pete Garrison was clearly committed to resolving the situation once and for all, and he had the resources to bring overwhelming force to bear. What had started as a simple confrontation was rapidly escalating into something much more dangerous. "We need to even the odds somehow," Jake said, lowering the spyglass. "2 people can't hold off an army, no matter how good our defensive position is." "There may be a way," Ayana said thoughtfully, "but it would be dangerous, and it would require you to trust me completely." Jake studied her face, seeing something calculating in her dark eyes. "What do you have in mind?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "There are other Apache in this territory," she said finally. "Not many, and they're careful to avoid the attention of the authorities. But they might be willing to help if they believe their own safety was at stake." "You said they wouldn't risk exposing themselves," Jake reminded her. "That was before Garrison escalated like this," Ayana replied. "If he succeeds in driving me out using this much force, what's to stop him from coming after them next?" Sometimes survival requires taking a stand before your enemies become too strong to resist. Jake could see the logic in her reasoning, but he also understood the risks. "How will we contact them? And how do we know they won't just decide we're more trouble than we're worth?" Ayana smiled, and for the first time since Jake had met her, he saw something almost playful in her expression. "You'll have to trust Apache methods," she said, "and you'll have to be willing to leave the canyon temporarily." The idea of abandoning their defensive position made Jake's tactical instincts scream in protest. But as he looked out at the growing enemy camp, he realized that conventional defensive tactics weren't going to be enough. They needed allies, and that meant taking risks. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Ayana's plan was both simple and audacious. She would use old Apache signaling methods to contact the scattered survivors of other clans, while Jake would create a diversion that would draw the garrison men's attention away from her activities. It would require him to leave the safety of the canyon and operate in the open desert, using hit-and-run tactics to harass the enemy camp. "You're talking about guerrilla warfare," Jake said as Ayanna outlined her strategy. "That's dangerous for someone working alone." "It is what my people did for generations," Ayanna replied. "Strike quickly, disappear into the desert, strike again from a different direction. The key is never to be where your enemies expect you to be." Jake had to admit the plan had merit. The garrison men were organized for a conventional assault on the canyon, not for dealing with mobile harassment attacks. If he could disrupt their preparations and keep them off balance, it would buy Ayanna time to contact potential allies. They spent the morning making final preparations. Ayanna showed Jake the traditional Apache signals she would use, smoke patterns during the day, fire signals at night, and carefully placed arrangements of rocks that would convey messages to those who knew how to read them. She also gave him detailed instructions about the local terrain, including water sources and hiding places that might not be obvious to someone unfamiliar with the desert. "Remember," she told him as they prepared to part ways, "the desert is your ally if you understand it, but it will kill you quickly if you make mistakes. Stay near water, avoid traveling during the hottest part of the day, and never assume you know what lies beyond the next hill." Jake nodded, checking his weapons and supplies one final time. He would be carrying his rifle, pistol, and enough ammunition for a sustained campaign. His horse was well-rested and equipped for desert travel, with extra water and provisions that should last several days if rationed carefully. "How will I find you again?" Jake asked. Ayanna smiled and pointed to a distinctive rock formation visible from the canyon rim. "When you see 3 smoke columns rising from that peak during daylight, you will know it is time to return. But do not come directly back here. They may be watching. Circle around and approach from the north, where there is a hidden trail that will bring you to the upper canyon." Jake memorized the landmarks and instructions, knowing that his life might depend on following them exactly. As he prepared to mount his horse, Ayanna placed a hand on his arm. "Be careful out there," she said quietly. "I have already lost everyone I cared about. I do not wish to lose you as well." The simple statement hit Jake harder than any declaration of love might have. In her understated way, Ayanna was telling him that he had become important to her, that his survival mattered for reasons beyond their tactical partnership. The knowledge that someone cared whether he lived or died was both warming and sobering. "I'll be back," Jake promised. "You just worry about finding us some help." Jake's first target was the garrison supply wagon, which he'd observed being unloaded earlier that morning. It was positioned on the edge of the enemy camp, guarded by only 2 men who seemed more interested in sharing a bottle of whiskey than maintaining proper security. The wagon represented a significant investment in time and resources, and destroying it would send a clear message about the cost of continuing this campaign. Jake approached the wagon during the heat of midday, when most of the enemy camp was seeking shade and the guards were at their most complacent. He'd left his horse hidden in a dry wash about half a mile away and covered the remaining distance on foot, using every piece of available cover to mask his approach. The guards were indeed drunk, passing the bottle back and forth while complaining about the heat and their assignment. Jake was able to get within 50 yards of the wagon without being detected, close enough to see that it contained ammunition, food supplies, and what appeared to be several cases of dynamite. Jake smiled grimly as he prepared his attack. If Garrison wanted to play with explosives, Jake was happy to show him how dangerous they could be. He waited until both guards were distracted, then made his move. A quick sprint brought him to the rear of the wagon, where he could work without being seen from the camp. Jake used his knife to cut open several ammunition boxes, scattering bullets and cartridges around the wagon bed. Then he found the dynamite cases and carefully removed 2 sticks along with the fuses and blasting caps needed to detonate them. Setting up the improvised bomb took only a few minutes, but Jake knew the real trick would be getting away before it exploded. He needed enough time to reach a safe distance, while also ensuring that the guards didn't discover the device and raise an alarm. Jake solved the problem by creating a long fuse using cordage from his pack combined with gunpowder from the scattered cartridges. It was crude, but effective. The fuse would burn slowly and quietly for several minutes before reaching the dynamite. He lit the fuse and began his retreat, moving as quickly as possible while still maintaining concealment. Jake had covered about 200 yards when the explosion occurred, sending a column of flame and smoke high into the desert sky. The sound echoed off the distant canyon walls like thunder, and Jake could hear shouts of alarm and confusion from the enemy camp. The psychological effect was exactly what Jake had hoped for. The garrison men had thought they were dealing with a couple of desperate fugitives holed up in a canyon. Instead, they were now facing an enemy who could strike at will, destroying their supplies and threatening their safety even in what they'd assumed was a secure camp. Jake didn't wait to observe the results of his handiwork. He made his way back to his horse and moved to a new position several miles away, where he could watch the enemy camp through his spyglass while remaining safely out of range. The explosion had clearly rattled the garrison forces. Jake could see them reorganizing their camp, posting additional sentries, and moving their remaining supplies to more defensible positions. Several men had been dispatched to search the immediate area, but they were looking for an enemy who was already long gone. Over the next 3 days, Jake conducted a systematic campaign of harassment against the garrison forces. He struck at their water supplies, stampeded their horses, and picked off isolated sentries with carefully aimed rifle shots. Each attack was carefully planned to maximize damage while minimizing risk, and Jake never struck from the same position twice. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. Through his spyglass, Jake could see that the enemy camp was becoming increasingly paranoid and disorganized. Men were jumping at shadows, and arguments were breaking out between different factions within the group. Some were clearly ready to abandon the campaign and return to town, while others seemed determined to press on regardless of the cost. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake saw what he'd been waiting for. 3 columns of smoke rose from the distinctive rock formation Ayanna had indicated, signaling that it was time for him to return to the canyon. But as Jake prepared to leave his current position, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A new group of riders was approaching the garrison camp from the east, and these men wore the blue uniforms of the United States Cavalry. Pete Garrison had indeed called in his connections, bringing federal troops into what had been a private dispute. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything Jake had anticipated. Jake counted at least 20 soldiers, led by an officer whose bearing suggested considerable experience. This wasn't a token force sent to make an appearance. These were professional military men equipped and prepared for serious combat operations. Jake realized that his guerrilla campaign, while successful in its limited objectives, had probably contributed to Garrison's decision to involve the army. By proving that the situation couldn't be resolved through conventional means, Jake had inadvertently forced his enemy to escalate to the next level. The knowledge that federal troops were now involved changed everything. Jake and Ayanna were no longer just fighting a wealthy rancher and his hired guns. They were potentially facing charges of resisting federal authority, which could bring the full weight of the territorial government down on their heads. Jake began his circuitous journey back to the canyon, his mind racing with the implications of this new development. He promised Ayanna that he would return, but he was bringing news that might make her regret asking for his help. They were no longer fighting for her homeland. They might be fighting for their lives. The hidden trail Ayanna had described was almost impossible to find, but Jake eventually located the subtle markers she'd mentioned. He left his horse in a concealed position and made the final approach on foot, moving as quietly as possible through the maze of rocks and crevices that guarded the upper canyon. Jake found Ayanna waiting for him at their prearranged meeting point, and her expression told him immediately that she'd already seen the approaching cavalry. But there was something else in her face as well, a fierce satisfaction that suggested her own mission had been successful. "You saw the soldiers," she said without preamble. Jake nodded grimly. "About 20 of them, with an officer who looks like he knows his business. Garrison's playing for keeps now." "So are we," Ayanna replied, and something in her tone made Jake look at her more sharply. "You found allies?" Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade. "Better than that. I found angry Apache warriors who are tired of running and hiding. They've decided that if the white men want a war, they'll give them one." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. "How many?" "Enough," Ayanna said. "And they know this country better than any cavalry officer ever will. The garrisons wanted to escalate this fight. Now they'll discover what escalation really means." As if summoned by her words, figures began emerging from concealment all around them. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he realized these were Iana's allies, not enemies. Apache warriors materialized from hiding places he hadn't even known existed, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready for battle. Jake found himself looking at about 15 men, all clearly experienced fighters who moved with the deadly grace of born predators. These weren't reservation Apache beaten down by years of confinement. These were free warriors who'd managed to evade capture and maintain their traditional way of life. The leader of the group stepped forward, and Jake could see immediately why the others followed him. He was a man in his 40s, with scars that spoke of many battles and eyes that missed nothing. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English. "I'm called Iron Wolf," he said, studying Jake with obvious curiosity. "Iana tells us you are a warrior who fights for honor instead of money. This is rare among your people." Jake met the Apache leader's gaze steadily. "I fight for what's right," he said simply. "And what's happening here isn't right." Iron Wolf nodded approvingly. "The soldiers think they hunt two desperate fugitives. Instead, they will find a war party that knows every rock and crevice in this territory. It will be an education for them." Jake looked around at the assembled warriors and felt both hope and trepidation. These men could indeed even the odds against the combined garrison and cavalry forces, but their involvement also meant that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. What had started as a simple dispute over land rights was becoming something that could have territorial or even national implications. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jake asked Iron Wolf. "Once you attack federal troops, there'll be no going back. The army will hunt you across 3 territories if necessary." Iron Wolf's smile was grim but determined. "They hunt us already," he said. "At least this way, we die fighting for something that matters instead of slowly starving on the reservation." Jake realized that there was no point in trying to dissuade them. These men had made their decision based on their own understanding of honor and survival, and they would follow through regardless of the consequences. "In that case," Jake said, "we'd better make sure we win." The combined forces of Pete Garrison and the cavalry made their move at dawn on the 7th day, just as Jake had predicted they would. The attack began with an artillery barrage from a small howitzer the soldiers had brought with them, the shells exploding against the canyon walls in thunderous displays of rock and smoke. The sound echoed through the desert like the wrath of angry gods, sending wildlife fleeing in all directions. Jake and Iana crouched behind their carefully constructed stone barricades, feeling the ground shake with each explosion. The Apache warriors had dispersed throughout the canyon according to the battle plan Iron Wolf had devised during their strategy sessions over the past 2 days. Each man knew his position, his responsibilities, and his escape route if the situation became untenable. "They're trying to soften us up before the main assault," Jake shouted over the noise of the bombardment. "Standard military tactics." Iana nodded, her face calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Iron Wolf expected this. The real battle begins when they try to enter the canyon. The artillery barrage lasted for 20 minutes, filling the air with dust and debris but doing little actual damage to the defenders. The Apache had chosen their positions well, using the natural protection of the canyon walls and carefully positioned boulders to shield themselves from the indirect fire. When the shelling finally stopped, an ominous quiet settled over the desert. Jake peered through a gap in his defensive position and saw the assault force forming up at the canyon entrance. The cavalry officer, whose name Jake had learned was Major Bradley, had organized his men into 2 groups. The first would make a frontal assault through the narrow entrance, while the second would attempt to scale the canyon walls and attack from above. "Here they come," Jake called out to Iana, checking his rifle one final time. The first wave of attackers entered the canyon in a disciplined formation, their blue uniforms making them easy targets against the red rock walls. But Major Bradley was no fool. He'd positioned sharpshooters on the rim to provide covering fire, and his men moved with the careful precision of experienced soldiers. Iron Wolf's voice echoed from somewhere high above, calling out commands in Apache. Immediately, the canyon erupted with the sound of gunfire as the hidden warriors opened up on the advancing troops. The crossfire was devastating, catching the soldiers in a deadly funnel with no adequate cover. Jake added his own rifle fire to the barrage, picking his targets carefully and making every shot count. Beside him, Iana's bow sang repeatedly, her arrows finding their marks with deadly accuracy. The combination of Apache tactics and superior defensive positions was taking a terrible toll on the attacking force. But the soldiers were professionals, and they adapted quickly to the situation. Major Bradley ordered his men to take cover and return fire, using their superior firepower to suppress the defenders while other troops worked their way up the canyon walls from multiple directions. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Apache warriors used every trick they'd learned in generations of warfare, appearing and disappearing like ghosts while maintaining a steady rate of fire on the trapped soldiers. But the cavalry had numbers and ammunition on their side, and they slowly began to gain ground despite their heavy casualties. Jake realized the turning point was coming when he saw Apache warriors beginning to fall back from their forward positions. They weren't retreating in panic. Iron Wolf's discipline was too good for that, but they were conducting a fighting withdrawal that would eventually lead to the defenders being overwhelmed. "We need to do something dramatic," Jake told Ayanna during a brief lull in the fighting. "Something that will break their morale and force them to withdraw." Ayanna looked at him sharply. "What do you have in mind?" Jake had been thinking about this moment since the battle began, weighing options and calculating risks. Pete Garrison is back there with the reserves, directing this whole operation. If something happened to him, his hired guns would probably lose their enthusiasm for the fight. That would mean leaving our defensive position, Ayanna pointed out, going out into the open where they could surround you. "Not me," Jake said quietly. "Us. I'm not leaving you behind again." Ayanna stared at him for a moment, then smiled fiercely. "Then we do this the Apache way. Fast, silent, and without mercy." Jake and Ayanna slipped out of the canyon through one of the hidden passages Iron Wolf had shown them, leaving the main battle behind as they worked their way around to the enemy rear. The sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls behind them, but Jake forced himself to focus on the mission at hand. Pete Garrison had established his command post about half a mile from the canyon entrance, positioned on high ground that gave him a clear view of the battle while keeping him safely out of range of the defenders. Jake could see him through a spyglass, standing next to a large tent and gesturing animatedly as he gave orders to his subordinates. 6 men guarding him, Jake observed. All professionals, well-armed and alert. Ayanna studied the enemy position with the practiced eye of a warrior. "The approach from the east offers the best concealment," she said. "But we'll have to cross open ground for the last 100 yards. Jake nodded, understanding the tactical challenge they faced. Getting close to Garrison would require perfect timing and coordination, and they would only get one chance. If they failed, they would be trapped in the open with nowhere to run. They waited until the sounds of battle from the canyon reached a crescendo, indicating that all attention would be focused on the main fight. Then they began their approach, moving from cover to cover with the patient stealth of hunting predators. Jake had always considered himself reasonably skilled at fieldcraft, but watching Ayanna move through the desert terrain was like getting a masterclass in the art of concealment. She seemed to flow between the rocks and brush like water, making no sound and leaving barely any trace of her passage. They reached the final piece of cover, a low ridge that put them within 100 yards of Garrison's command post. From here, Jake could see the details of the enemy position, the locations of the guards, the layout of the camp, and, most importantly, Pete Garrison himself. The rancher was a big man, probably in his 50s, with the kind of commanding presence that came from years of getting his own way through money and intimidation. He wore expensive clothes despite the desert setting, and the ivory-handled revolvers on his hips were clearly more for show than practical use. "On my signal," Jake whispered to Ayanna, "you take the 2 guards on the left, I'll handle the ones on the right. Then we go straight for Garrison before the others can react." Ayanna nodded, nocking an arrow and drawing her bow halfway. Her face was painted with traditional war paint she'd applied before they left the canyon. And in that moment, Jake saw her not as the woman he'd come to care for, but as the Apache warrior she'd always been beneath the surface. Jake counted down silently, watching for the perfect moment when the guards would be at their most vulnerable. When it came, he squeezed the trigger of his rifle, taking down the first guard with a shot to the chest. Ayanna's bow sang twice in quick succession, and both of her targets dropped without making a sound. The remaining guards reacted quickly, but not quickly enough. Jake was already moving, his rifle discarded in favor of his pistol as he charged across the open ground toward the command post. Ayanna was beside him, a second arrow nocked and ready as they closed the distance. Pete Garrison was reaching for his fancy revolvers when Jake's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining guards tried to form a defensive line, but they were caught off balance and outnumbered by the ferocity of the attack. Jake put 2 more bullets into the nearest guard, while Ayanna's third arrow found its mark in another man's throat. The final guard broke and ran, apparently deciding that whatever Garrison was paying him wasn't worth dying for. Jake stood over the wounded rancher, his smoking pistol pointed at the man's head. Pete Garrison clutched his bleeding shoulder and glared up at his captor with a mixture of pain and fury. "You've just signed your own death warrant, stranger," Garrison snarled. "The territorial government will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this." "Maybe," Jake replied calmly, "but you won't be around to see it." "Wait," Ayanna said, placing a hand on Jake's arm. "He might be more valuable to us alive." Jake looked at her questioningly, but he could see the calculation in her dark eyes. She had a plan, and he trusted her judgment enough to hear her out. "Major Bradley," Ayanna called out in a voice that carried clearly across the desert. "Your employer is down. Come discuss terms, or we finish what we started." The sound of gunfire from the canyon had diminished considerably, suggesting that the battle was reaching a critical point. Jake could see dust clouds in the distance that indicated the movement of large groups of men, but he couldn't tell whether the Apache were retreating or the cavalry was withdrawing. Major Bradley appeared about 10 minutes later, riding toward them under a white flag with 2 of his subordinates. He was a lean, professional-looking officer with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in the field. When he saw Pete Garrison on the ground, his expression tightened with barely controlled anger. "Release Mr. Garrison immediately," Bradley demanded. "You're interfering with a federal operation." "What federal operation would that be, Major?" Jake asked mildly. "Last I checked, the United States Army wasn't in the business of stealing land from its rightful owners." Bradley's face flushed with anger. "Miss Running Deer is a fugitive from the San Carlos Reservation. We're here to return her to federal custody." Jake looked at Ayanna in surprise. This was the first he'd heard about any connection to the reservation system. But Ayanna's expression remained calm as she responded to the Major's accusation. "I was never assigned to San Carlos," she said clearly. "My people were granted treaty rights to remain in this territory under the agreement signed with General Crook in 1872. We have violated no federal laws." Major Bradley looked uncertain for the first time since his arrival. "I have orders from the territorial governor." "The territorial governor has no authority over treaty Indians," Ayanna interrupted. "And Mr. Garrison has no legal claim to treaty lands, regardless of what Spanish grants he may have purchased." Jake watched with admiration as Ayanna systematically dismantled the legal justification for the attack on her home. She knew the law better than the Army officer, and she wasn't afraid to use that knowledge to defend her rights. "Furthermore," Ayanna continued, "Mr. Garrison's men attacked us first. We were merely defending our treaty-guaranteed homeland against illegal encroachment." Major Bradley was clearly out of his depth when it came to the complex web of treaties, territorial law, and federal jurisdiction that governed Indian affairs. He'd been told this was a simple matter of returning a fugitive to the reservation, but Ayanna had just demonstrated that the situation was far more complicated. "I'll need to verify this information with my superiors," Bradley said finally. "While you're doing that," Jake interjected, "you might want to consider the cost of continuing this operation. I count about 8 of your men down, and the Apache haven't even gotten serious yet. How many more soldiers are you willing to sacrifice for Pete Garrison's greed?" The Major's jaw tightened, but Jake could see doubt creeping into his eyes. Professional soldiers didn't like taking heavy casualties for unclear objectives, especially when the legal justification for their mission was questionable. "What are your terms?" Bradley asked finally. Ayanna stepped forward, her bearing regal despite her trail-worn clothing and war paint. "Withdraw your forces and leave us in peace. In return, we'll release Mr. Garrison and make no further attacks on your men. And if we refuse..." Iron Wolf's voice answered from somewhere behind the Major, though the Apache leader himself remained invisible. "Then you can explain to your superiors why you lost an entire company to a handful of Apache warriors fighting on their own land." Bradley spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but Iron Wolf had already melted back into the landscape. The psychological effect was exactly what the Apache leader had intended, a demonstration that the cavalry was surrounded and outmatched in terrain they didn't understand. "You have 1 hour to decide," Iona said. "After that, we resume hostilities, and Mr. Garrison's usefulness to us ends." Major Bradley rode back to his lines, leaving Jake and Iona alone with their wounded captive. Pete Garrison had been listening to the entire exchange with growing alarm, clearly realizing that his scheme had backfired spectacularly. "You can't just leave me here," Garrison pleaded as Jake checked his wound. "These savages will torture me to death." "Funny how your attitude changes when you're the one who needs help," Jake observed. "Yesterday you were ready to kill this woman for the crime of living on her own land." Iona knelt beside the wounded rancher, her expression unreadable. "I'm not a savage, Mr. Garrison. I am a civilized human being who believes in justice and mercy, concepts that seem foreign to you." She began tending to his wound with supplies from her medical kit, her hands gentle despite everything he had done to her. Jake watched with amazement as she demonstrated the kind of compassion that Garrison had never shown to anyone. "Why are you helping him?" Jake asked quietly. "Because it is who I am," Iona replied simply. "My people taught me that how we treat our enemies says more about us than how we treat our friends." The hour passed slowly, with no word from the cavalry lines. Jake could see movement in the distance that suggested the soldiers were packing up their equipment, but he couldn't be sure whether they were preparing to withdraw or simply repositioning for another attack. Finally, Major Bradley returned under his white flag. His expression was grim, but resigned as he approached their position. "I've received new orders from Territorial Command," he announced. "I'm to withdraw my forces pending a full investigation of the legal issues involved in this matter." Jake felt a surge of relief that he tried not to show. The immediate threat was over, at least for now. But he knew that this victory would only be temporary unless they could find a more permanent solution to the underlying problem. "What about Garrison's men?" Jake asked. "They're free to leave or stay as they choose," Bradley replied. "They're not under my command, and I have no authority over them." As if summoned by his words, Tom Brennan appeared from the direction of the enemy camp. The big foreman looked haggard and defeated, his earlier confidence completely gone. "It's over, Mr. Garrison," Brennan said to his wounded employer. "Half the boys lit out when the shooting started, and the rest ain't interested in dying for somebody else's land grab." Pete Garrison cursed bitterly, but he was clearly beaten. His scheme had cost him money, men, and reputation, while gaining him nothing but a bullet wound and the enmity of some very dangerous people. "This ain't finished," Garrison snarled as Brennan helped him to his feet. "I've got friends in Washington, connections you can't imagine. I'll find a way to make you pay for this." "You're welcome to try," Iona replied calmly. "But next time, you might want to make sure you understand the law before you start a war." Jake watched as the defeated rancher was helped away, supported by his foreman and the few men who'd remained loyal to him. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction, but instead he felt only a weary sense of completion. They'd won this battle, but the larger war between the Apache people and the expanding white settlements would continue long after this particular conflict was resolved. Major Bradley departed with his remaining troops, leaving behind the bodies of the soldiers who died in the canyon assault. Iron Wolf's warriors emerged from concealment to help bury the dead, showing respect for fallen enemies even as they celebrated their victory. As the sun set over the desert, Jake found himself sitting by the stream in Iona's canyon, watching her tend to her garden as if nothing unusual had happened. The plants were thriving despite the recent violence, drawing life from the same earth that had been soaked with blood just hours earlier. "So what happens now?" Jake asked as Iona joined him by the water's edge. "Now we live," she replied simply. "We plant crops, we tend our animals, we honor our ancestors. We do the things that people do when they're not fighting for their lives. And when the next Pete Garrison comes along." Iona smiled, and Jake saw steel beneath the gentleness. "Then we fight again. It is the way of things in this territory. But at least now we know we don't have to fight alone." Jake looked around at the Apache warriors who were making temporary camps throughout the canyon. Some would return to their hidden refuges in the morning, but others had indicated they might stay and help Iona rebuild her clan. The isolation that had made her so vulnerable was finally ending. "Iron Wolf says there are other survivors out there," Iona continued. "People who've been scattered and hiding, afraid to show themselves. But word of today's victory will spread. They'll know that it's possible to fight back and win. Jake nodded, understanding the larger implications of what had happened here. They hadn't just defended one woman's homeland. They'd struck a blow for all the dispossessed people who'd been driven from their homes by greed and prejudice. What about us? Jake asked quietly. What happens between us? Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the stars that were beginning to appear in the desert sky. That depends, she said finally. Are you planning to start drifting again, now that the excitement is over? Jake considered the question seriously. The old urge to move on was still there, the ingrained habit of avoiding permanent attachments. But as he looked around at this hidden paradise and the remarkable woman who'd carved out a life here through sheer determination, he realized that some things were worth staying for. I was thinking I might try putting down roots, Jake said, if I can find the right place. Ayana smiled, and Jake saw his future reflected in her eyes. I think this canyon could use a guardian, she said. Someone help protect it, and the people who call home. Jake reached over and took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the scars that told of old battles. They were both survivors, both fighters, both people who'd learned to stand alone when necessary. But they were stronger together than either could be apart. Then, I guess I'm not going anywhere, Jake said, as the desert night settled around them. Jake Morrison realized that his years of drifting were finally over. He'd found his place in the world, and, more importantly, he found someone to share it with. The future would bring new challenges and probably new enemies, but they would face them together. In the end, Jake reflected, that made all the difference. They were no longer just two people fighting against impossible odds. They were the beginning of something new, something stronger than the forces that sought to destroy them. And in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the Arizona territory, that was enough to build a life on.